You know what I'm going to talk about the entirety of right now is Scott Pilgrim versus the World, because I read the whole thing today. Well, technically yesterday as well. Read it in about 2 days. It is doesn't take that long. So why am I reading this? Well, my history with Scott Pilgrim. Let's see. It's always been a movie that people have referenced that I've known of for years. I've seen so many random little clips. Not quite a Pulp Fiction situation where I feel like I know the whole thing, but I just know vaguely enough about it. So when I started dating Kat, about 4 weeks into us dating, which was so... she messages me on Discord and she goes, I need you to get into a call right now. And I was like, okay. And I get into a call and she's like, we have to watch Scott Pilgrim versus the World. And I said, okay. And so I sat in my chair on a Discord call, and I watched Scott Pilgrim in 480p through a pirate website over a Discord stream where Katrina's oversensitive Chromebook microphone kept picking up cars driving past in the background. You know, the way that the movie was meant to be seen. The way that David Lynch would want me to watch his movie. So, I mean, I did see it. I did watch the movie. It's not like I watched it on a plane or anything. And, I remember enjoying the film. It's not the optimal viewing experience, obviously. And it's so weird, because, like, our 4th date, which was, like, later that week, I went over to her house, and she owns the movie. But for some reason, she couldn't have just waited, like, 3 days for me to go over. And I don't know why. It was so pressing to her that she needed to establish Scott Pilgrim versus the World early in our relationship. It was very important to her. And I remember liking the film. Yeah, I liked it. It wasn't one of those things. I could definitely see why someone would watch it and it would be really big to them. I think I was already at a point 2 years ago where I'd seen enough formative media that, like, watching it was like, oh, that's cool, as opposed to, holy shit, this is the craziest thing. I've never seen anything like this. Because Scott Pilgrim, so it's very important to Katrina. It's like a big thing to her. I think it's like her favorite movie. It's like one of her favorite things overall. I always... Side story. I remember asking her one time in conversation. I was like, hey, so, like, when did you... I forget what I asked first. I was like... I definitely asked her when she realized she was trans first. And she goes, back in, like, 2017. And I was like, really? Huh. And then I thought about it for a second. I'm like, when did you watch Scott Pilgrim? And she said, I think like 3 or 4 months after that. And I was like, are you really? And for some reason, I had just assumed that she had watched that movie years before she came out. And the fact that it was the reverse made way less sense to me for some reason. And I think I said, wow. I think my exact words were, wow, imagine becoming a woman just in time to be ruined by Ramona Flowers. And I'm reusing that joke now because I think it was funny and she laughed at it and it made me feel good that she laughed at a joke that I made. She loves Ramona Flowers. She owns the fucking bag. I think she had one and then it got stained and I think she replaced it with another one. Babe, I could just text her. She replaced it. Or did she make one? Did she make like a new... Did she like make one herself? She has the Ramona Flowers bag with the star on it, right? She's cosplayed the character before. I don't know. She loves Scott Pilgrim versus the World. She frequently compares me to Scott Pilgrim because I'm a nerdy, I guess, skinny white guy. And honestly, for a while I took a comparison to Scott Pilgrim as being an insult. I don't know if I do after I read the comic. So it's always been this thing, and I've always been like, okay, yeah, that's her thing. And I figured because I watched the movie, it was, I've covered that base with her. But you might have heard somewhat recently that there was an announcement that there's going to be, I believe, also a Netflix animated series, an animated adaptation of the comic book. And they're getting the entire voice cast back. They're getting the entire, not voice cast, but the entire cast from the film back to reprise their roles. And I believe Anna Monoguchi, who did the music for the video game, is also, and maybe some for the movie, I'm not sure, is also doing soundtrack. And apparently this is something that like everyone's wanted for a really long time. When I say everyone, I mean like the entire cast and what's his name? Brian Lee O'Malley, the author, have wanted for a really long time, was an animated full adaptation. And obviously she's going to make me watch it. And I figured, you know what? I'm interested. She owns the entire comic, graphic novel, whatever series. It's like 6 volumes. She owns all of them. So I borrowed them. And it took me like 2 days to read. I finally got around to it. And I took the Scott Pilgrimage, as I call it. And I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great, actually. It took me, I think, 1 volume. It took me by the end of volume 2, I think I understood what it was doing. When I sort of anticipated that when I read the comic, I almost said manga, like a fucking dork, like a loser. I was kind of anticipating that when I read the comic, it would make me like the film less. And for a while it did, and by the end it didn't. It took me, I actually was feeling a little bit of friction with the story until the end of the 2nd volume, and then I think I understood what was going on, like what it was going for, if that makes sense. So if you don't know anything about Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which I would find surprising, but I'll just quickly summarize it in brief. It was a graphic novel series written, I think the first one came out in like 2004. It came out between 2004 and 2007. And it's about this guy. How do I even describe what it's about? Because there's a lot of stuff that happens. The basic premise, the pitch, is that it's a guy named Scott Pilgrim who's like the world's biggest fucking loser. He lives in Toronto, Canada. And he's 23 years old, and when the story begins, he's dating a high schooler. He's dating a 17-year-old girl named Knives Chow. That's just her name. And he's in a band. He's in like a shitty rock band. They're not shitty. They're the greatest thing in the world. And when all of a sudden, he kind of gets snapped out of this sort of stupor he's in, and kind of into a new one, when he runs into this girl, Ramona Flowers, who is this incredibly mysterious delivery girl for Amazon, for Amazon.com, which in 2004 was like a book site that also like maybe sold CDs or something. It was like a Barnes & Noble online back at that time. And it's really funny because they keep the name Amazon, but they have like legally distinct names for other stuff, and it's kind of funny because I don't know if you could do that today. So he's trying to get with Ramona, but before he can do that, like they're sort of like dating, but before he can like she can like fully date him, I guess, he has to defeat her 7 evil exes. She she has a lot of ex they say ex-boyfriends, but she insists on exes, you know, not being gender specific, and that's a setup for a thing. And all of these exes, they're like in a league. All of her ex-partners are in a league together, and they show up and they're gonna fight Scott Pilgrim. It's like No More Heroes. Wait, hang on. What else were we talking about that I said this is a lot like No More Heroes? And then she said that one of her friends said that Scott Pilgrim was a lot like No More Heroes. We were watching something like that. We encountered something along those lines, but I can't remember. Anyway, that's the plot, and it's a zany, kind of absurd story with a lot of fourth wall breaking and very conversational, kind of dry humor dialogue, and tons of little references to stuff like video games and pop culture and stuff like that. Honestly, which is aged pretty well, I have to say. And it's very much entrenched in the Toronto 20-something going to parties scene in 2005. So that's like the basic premise. And now from here on out, I'm gonna just spoil fucking everything, 'cause that's what I do here. So the first like volume or two, I was a little like, okay, I was using the movie as sort of a frame of reference for the comic because it's what I've seen, obviously. And I was curious what was different and what was changed. When I talk about friction, they have very different feelings. I think what I've realized, I've had a bit of time today. I've had a couple hours to digest the story now. The movie and the comic are kind of like two different stories. Like, they have the same characters for the most part. They follow a lot of the same. The movie pulls a lot of things from the comic. And a lot of things are similar, and okay, I see how they took that and they worked that in here, and some things are combined into this scene and all that. But really, like, they're different stories about different things, and the mediums drastically affect, I think, the experience of consuming both of them. So, for instance, when I talk about friction, the first volume is very much like we're grounded in reality. There's a little bit of like, huh? What? Huh? And you're like, maybe some stuff is just sort of allegoric or symbolic, like the way that Ramona kind of like seems to roller skate like through reality, like teleport and stuff. And you're just like, okay, just some weird stuff. And then by the end, when the first fight with the first ex, Matthew, happens, it goes into like craziness. Like the story stops taking place in the real world. And it was very strange to me. Funny enough, even having seen the movie and knowing that it had this kind of tone, reading the comic, it was very jarring. Where it's like, all of a sudden there's this guy who pops in and he has magic powers and he's shooting laser beams out of his hands. And all of a sudden Scott can has these superhuman fighting abilities. And characters are just like, he's referencing like he what is it? He summons demon hipster chicks. And you're like, what? That throw fireballs? And then Scott, all of a sudden, all the characters who are like up in the rafters at this like concert venue are suddenly down on the stage. You're like, what the fuck is happening? What is going on? And it feels really weird and like, what is it? And then by the end of the second volume, I kind of got the idea. So the story the in the world of Scott Pilgrim, the world feels very much, and like the events that happened feel like they're shaped by the characters' emotions and their story arcs, rather than the state of the world or the characters affecting each other's art. Does that make sense? Things happen in the story not because they necessarily make sense. There's never any kind... It's not like a real world. It doesn't really take place in the real world entirely. Which is a feeling that gets stronger, I think, as the book goes on. Which I think improves this a little bit, this sort of jarring quality a little bit. It's like... How do I say this? So, like... Okay, here's an example. So the second fight that happens with Lucas Lee, the actor guy, it's like, okay, they are scheduled to fight. I've already accepted the basic premise that Scott has to go fight these guys. So they're scheduled to fight, and like they just kind of show up. They just sort of show up, and Lucas is like sitting on a bench smoking or something, and he's like, "Oh, hi, I'm Scott Pilgrim. Are you Lucas Lee?" Excuse me. And then they're next to this like 100-year-old castle. It's been in Toronto for like a generation. And Lucas is like, "Oh yeah, you like Scott Pilgrim?" And then he just picks him up and he spins him around and he flings him into the castle and like destroys the wall. And then Scott walks out and he's like, "Fuck, okay, that's cool. Can we take like a breather?" And Lucas is like, "Yeah, that's cool." And then they just sort of sit down, and all the characters are just sitting down, like Scott's friends and Lucas. They were just sitting down and chatting about like random shit. And then they like resume the fight. And you're like, what? Like, none of this makes fucking sense. And then I kind of realized, oh, it's not supposed to. Like, if you get hung up... So I think this was I think the movie primed me the wrong way to think about the story. Going into the comic. Because the film has to have these 7 fights, it has to kind of structure itself around these fights, and it has to present them in a way that at least makes some sort of logical sense, because it's like a film with things happening in sequential sequence, right? In forward. And it has to like make sense on screen for an audience. And there's some parts, so like... the absurdism is absolutely in the film, but it's in the presentation. It's more so in the presentation. Like, and the thing is, I think that establishes that. That's why I didn't have as much friction with the weirdness in the movie. It's so weird. It's like this very minute, slight difference, but I think it was a big deal for the way that I experienced both of these things. So in the film, immediately, like you get that shot when they do the title drop, where Knives is listening to Scott's band, Sex Bomb, and they built like this set. She's just like in front of them on a couch, right? Like 5 feet away. But they built this whole set just for this one shot to do the title drop, where it's like this living room is suddenly stretched to be 20 feet long. And you get this slow pan out, so you can get all the title sequence on the ground and all that. And immediately you're like, okay, things are a little wacky. And the things that I'm going to see are more like to sell an idea and to sell a tone and a mood. And an aesthetic, right? So that is like very quickly established. In the book, that only really starts happening. Like the presentation is sort of funky, like the panel layout or the dialogue, and there'll be little jokes and stuff, but that just seems like it's different. It's different because, I don't know, it feels more like there's less upfront absurdity at the start of the comic, right? And you have to kind of work your way into it. And I realized eventually that, characters will, like in that fight with Lucas, characters will just do shit. they'll just do random stuff. Well, not like random, but seemingly unmotivated things. Because, like, within, like, say, these fights, right? And at a certain point, you start to realize that, like, the fights, the story is not, it doesn't even really feel like it's about the fights. The movie is about the fights. Like, sorry, I should say the plot is about the fights in the movie. The plot is about the fights. The plot in the comic, the fights almost feel secondary or even tertiary to the things that are happening. The fights are just there. It feels like oftentimes to just be a thing that is happening in the background to move the story along by introducing some characters or some concepts. Like, the dialogue in the fights will be important, but, like, Knives is gonna jump Ramona at the, like, Toronto Public Library, and she's gonna attack her with swords. And Ramona's gonna pick up a piece of modern art, like a big metal beam, and fucking bat her around the room. And you're like, what? And it's like, yeah, because shit's just happening. They're just having a conflict. You aren't supposed to take this the most seriously in the world, that this is a thing that's really happening in reality, if that makes sense. And once I got that, I think the whole story flowed a lot better. And I was able to get really invested in it. There was a thing that I had in the film, which was more answered here, which was, why does Ramona like Scott? And it's sort of implied, maybe I should have picked up on it. Because I'm like, because it's weird, because in the first time they meet, Ramona, like, doesn't want to be around him. It's, like, super awkward, and they don't want to talk to each other. And then Scott orders some CDs from Amazon, so Ramona will, because she's the only, like, delivery runner in the city. Because Amazon was very small. They're very tiny. Very teeny tiny. And so she'll show up to his door, and then he'll ask her out. Imagine you're her, like, that happens to you, and his date idea is like, let's meet up at 8:30 at night after dark in, like, the woods. Not the woods, but like the park. Like, lady, you're from New York? These are your survival skills? You're gonna get your organs stolen. What the fuck? She's stupid. But it works out, right? It works out. And for some, I'm like, why does she like him? Because she just kind of, on this date, she just kind of flips to liking him. And it seems kind of out of nowhere. Where it seemed like before she was just sort of begrudgingly letting him speak. When he was, like, asking her out. And it's kind of a mystery in and of itself. Ramona is, like, a mysterious person, and that's a big part of her character. I think I like the characters more in the comic, because they have a lot more time to, I don't know, just talk about themselves, or avoid talking about themselves, which is kind of like a key plot point. The movie cuts a lot of stuff out. If you've only seen the movie, it cuts a lot of stuff out. The first maybe 3 volumes are roughly like, okay, yeah, I remember this from the movie, I remember this. And then after that, it steadily starts diverging to the point where I was like, wow, this is a totally different story. And I found a lot of things really interesting about it. I think I got Scott's characterization a little better in the comic. At least I picked up on it a little more. So there's this immediate thing of, like, Scott Pilgrim is a child groomer because he's going out with a 17-year-old. And weirdly enough, none of his friends, who all seem like relatively more responsible adults, seem to be really concerned about this, besides telling him he just has to break up with her. I would be very alarmed if that was happening to, like, someone I knew was I'd be like, sorry, what? That's kind of weird. Like, I would have a probably have a big problem with that if I knew someone who was 23 and they were going out with a 17-year-old who's still in high school. And then you kind of realize with just some like a couple sort of almost in passing, dialogue in passing, that like the reason no one's very alarmed is that everyone knows Scott is such a toothless coward that he couldn't even bring himself to molest her. Like, he just rides the bus and sometimes maybe will hold her hand. And he will never do anything with her because he's way too spineless. Ramona, I found more, I liked her more, again, just because you get to see more of her. I really enjoyed how laid back the comic is. And you lose a lot of that in the film because it has to fit 7 fights in there. And they get some of that, like, they fit in some characterization. Like, they do the best they can, I think, to fit that whole story into a film. But, like, man, it's just like nice. It's kind of pleasant because you spend most of the story just like kind of hanging out. People going back and forth. Someone says this to someone. They have a conversation about that. This thing develops over here. And, you know, they go on a date. Like, the fight with Todd is so funny. Talk about, like, the fights just kind of being, like, almost secondary. They have to, like, reschedule the fight, like, 3 times. Because something, like, just keeps happening. And, like, it's not working out. And eventually they have to, like... can we... dude, I'm, like, really tuckered out. Like, we all kind of want to go home. You feel like Friday night or something? They're like, oh, yeah, we can show up then. And then they'll just show up. And then, like, in the interim between the fights, Scott and Ramona will go on a date or they'll have breakfast and, you know, they'll get a scene with, like, Kim talking to Steven or something like that. And it's so chilled out and the characters are so likable and the dialogue is really really well paced. Everyone has a lot of personality. All the characters end up just being very, very likable for that reason. Like, I felt invested in them. Even the ones who are, like, ostensibly bad people or have a ton of flaws, I like following them as characters. Like, you kind of start to realize that, like, Ramona has a ton of problems of her own. She's just, like, way more mysterious about it. I don't want to talk about that yet. I don't know. I really liked, you know, once they were dating, I was like, I like this. I like this feel and this vibe that is occasionally interrupted by violence. What do I want to talk about? Because there is a lot of stuff that interested me. I really enjoyed the new stuff that took me by surprise. Okay. So... when I talk about the film and the comic being different stories, what I mean is the movie has to... There's many points in the comic where they will suddenly cut to like a backstory or like a memory, right? A flashback to someone's past in something like that, and it might only be for like a couple pages, and it's a comic book, so like 3 pages with no, like, very little dialogue goes by very quickly, and it just, like, reading wise, it's just like that. You just kind of flip through it, but it's like this information that is just consistently sprinkled throughout. But it's like in a film, you don't have that luxury. Like, it's way more work to include that stuff, and it would beef up the movie a lot. It would beef it up a lot. And you would kind of have to include characters like Lisa, who is not in the film at all. And I found very interesting. Her part of the story, it's like this character that they set up, and it's like, oh, it's Scott's, like, childhood friend, and she's back in town. And I'm like, okay, this is probably... When she shows back up, I was like, okay, something's gonna happen here. Because Scott's acting kind of weird. And it feels weird for the both of them in some way. Like, if there was nothing there, you're like, all right, he wouldn't be having this reaction. But it's like all that stuff and where it leads and this whole kind of tumultuous situation. There's a lot of points in the comic where it feels like, man, stuff just is fucking really feels like it's in the shitter right now. Like, you'll just cut to someone and like someone's just mad at somebody all of a sudden, and you're like, and someone at like, what's wrong with that? And then they just explain off panel that person had like done something shitty to them, and you're like, oh, that like sucks. It sucks. But I really liked the Lisa stuff, and I think that contributed a lot. Okay, so, fuck. I keep getting split around because there's a lot to talk about, because I'm also like comparing it a lot to the movie. So, like, in a broad sense, I should say this stuff first to establish this first. In a broad sense, a lot of the stuff that they cut is like, okay, I totally get why you didn't have all this flashback stuff, because it kind of requires you to include way more. Like, if you're going to include the memories, you're going to have to include, like, this entire other character and arc and stuff like that. And you just don't have the fucking time. And probably other stuff on top of that. If I, like, if I had my head wrapped around the story a little better, I could probably... There might even be other stuff that's set up with those scenes, right? Those flashbacks. However, cutting that stuff out, that stuff is, like, integral, very integral to the message of the comic. Like, around the halfway point, it really starts to diverge in terms of what the story is. And it's slightly different, but it's like an important difference. There's a nuance. They rework the moral of the story. Excuse me, Jesus. They rework the moral in the movie to have it fit the story that's the plot that's left over, the story that's left over when you cut all that stuff out. In the movie, so like in the movie at the end, right? Like, fucking, it's funny because, like, man, the finale is, like, completely different in the comic. Even though it's, like, the same location and it's basically the same characters, completely different. I was like, wow, this is absolutely not what I remember from the film. And that was kind of fun because I was ready to be surprised. It's not just like, oh, I'm just going to read a straight adaptation. So in the movie, in that final battle with Gideon, Scott, the thing is like, okay, his final development is he gets the power of love. That's his power up. And then Gideon shatters that. And Scott earns the power, the power of self-respect. That's what it is. Which is pretty funny. And ultimately, that's what lets him defeat Gideon. And, I like the idea that Scott's character arc in the film is Scott Pilgrim is this loser who is essentially, how do I describe it? He thinks that he needs his life to be saved by some girl, which is Ramona. And ultimately he realizes that he had it inside of himself the whole time. And that even if he would have lost Ramona, he's going to do it because whatever. Because he wants to do it and he believes that he can do it. So, and he gains self-respect. In the comic, Scott earns the power of love like halfway through the story. And then loses that in the fight with Gideon. Ramona picks up the power of love, and Scott gains the power of understanding. And that is a very it might not seem that different, but it really affects what the story is about. Scott in the comics, his arc is about him His problem is that he's a fucking coward. He's a coward, and he can't fucking... He's in a state of arrested development. That's why he's dating a fucking high schooler. Because he, like, never mentally progressed past being a high schooler. And that feels, like, safe and comfortable to him to be able to listen to Knives talk about stupid high school drama. Because it's, like, a fake world that he gets to live in. And he hates being in the real world where he has, like, a shitty tiny apartment and no job and no independence. And he's basically chained to Wallace, who's the best character. Fucking love Wallace. And all of this is rooted in this just... And I like how there's no, like, deep backstory or trauma that at least that I could tell. It's just the way he is. He just can't fucking man up. He just can't be a fucking adult and face consequences or the real world. He's in a perpetual kind of childlike denial about the real world. And this knock-on effect causes him to be very self-centered. He's very self-serving and greedy in the story. The way that he, like, doesn't want to break up with Knives because that's hard, right? It's hard and it's scary, and he's too much of a pussy to confront her, right? And then he does, and that is like a character development moment fairly early on. That's sort of like the point of no return, I guess. He does confront her, but he's so apprehensive about it. I lost my train of thought. And that becomes a plot point later on that's fairly important, that Scott technically was cheating on the both of them at the same time. He was two-timing. And that's kind of distressing for Knives and Ramona. And, like, yeah, if you can't break up, if you like someone else, you should just be an adult and break up with them. Sorry, if you're dating someone you like someone else, just be an adult and break up with them. And just cut it off and start clean. Like, do not fuck around. It's not good. It leads to the other person jumping your new partner in a public library with knives. There's this recurring thing in the comic, which is alluded to, and then it really becomes important in, like, the last, I want to say 2 volumes, which is that Ramona's head glows. Completely absent in the movie. And eventually what is revealed, what the glow is, I thought it was going to be the mind control thing from the movie. No, that is completely original to the film. Again, like, the whole setup and context of the finale is entirely different between both of them. The glow, which Scott also experiences at key moments later in the story, what the glow is what Gideon refers to as internal emotional warfare. It's essentially it's a visible manifestation of someone being completely locked inside of their own head. And that's, like, completely Scott and Ramona. Scott knows almost nothing about Ramona, and they point it out, and throughout, like, everything about her is unknown, and that's kind of what attracts him to her. She's so mysterious. She's from America. But, like, he tries to ask her a question one time. Like, he tries to ask her how old she is. Which should be, I mean, for 2 young people, should be the least crazy question ever. And she can't tell him because she doesn't want to talk about it. Because Ramona is, like, trapped in her own head because of Gideon. She's trapped in her own self. She and Scott have the same problem. They have the exact same problem. And this causes them to do kind of shitty things to people. And I really like the moment when he's fighting Gideon, and Envy comes up after Gideon's been beaten, and she's trying to, like, ask him if he's okay. And he says something very callous to her. He says, like, shut up, I don't fucking need you. And it's this just very callous response to someone who genuinely is, like, showing some care for him. And Scott has this moment where he realizes, wait. And they don't spell it out. You have to intuit what he's realizing. He's like, wait, and you get these flashbacks to all of these other points in the story, which many of which have been in these flashback segments, which is why this whole part isn't in the movie, where characters have done things that were kind of uncool or very cold or standoffish. Like Scott didn't tell, Scott was dating, he was dating Kim in like high school and didn't tell her that he was moving. And she's like, what the fuck, dude? He had to tell Lisa, who's his totally not girlfriend, best friend. And then Lisa told her. And it's like other moments in the story where characters have said things and done things, and you realize, holy shit, all of these have been because of the same root problem, is because they can't be fucking adults. They can't just do the scary thing and either do something kind of unpleasant or accept someone else, right? Ramona like can't accept people. That's why she always the reason she has this horrible taste in men, which they bring up, and it's very much like a character flaw for her. She has terrible taste in men. Partners, sorry, because Roxy's there. She dates all these assholes. And they're like, it's kind of weird, like, that you just kind of attract terrible people into your life. And it's because, like, she cannot, like, what is it? How would I describe it? Well, she unlocks the power of love at the end of the story, right? So I think it's kind of implied that her problem is, number one, she's stuck in her own head and the effect that has on her. Whereas for Scott, it's almost like he's stuck in this, that causes him to be very cowardly and stuck in this naive world view, afraid of confrontation, and being very self-centered. I mean, it's called Scott Pilgrim versus the world. You know? For Ramona, it kind of results in her like being completely unable to like connect to other people, like to open herself up. In that way, she's almost also kind of self-serving. Like, how much is she actually I felt like in the movie, I remember before they do the mind control reveal thing, when Ramona is like basically breaking up with Scott, I was like, are you fucking kidding me? How much goddamn work this guy has gone through to win you over, how much fucking trouble you are, and he's still doing this, he's still going at it, and you're gonna walk out on him. And there's the mind control thing, and you're like, okay, all right. And in the comic, it makes more sense, because it's almost like she's scared to open up to him. It's like a very one-way relationship where Scott, like, there's these scenes of Scott just fucking talking her ear off about whatever nerdy shit he's into. I can't relate to that at all. I don't know anyone in my life who would be able to relate to that either. Sometimes I see Kat's eyes glaze over, and it looks like she's going to fall asleep, and then, okay, I should stop. It's an extreme, like, she's basically just Scott is actually putting way more effort into the relationship than she is. Because she can't. She's so scared to, like, invest herself into anyone decent. And that bites her in the ass. With this whole predicament they've gotten themselves into. So her, like, unlocking the power of love is now she can, like, actively open herself up to other people. And then she tells him how old she is. And it's, like, the least controversial thing. She's like, 24. She's 24. Oh, okay, it's not a big deal. Like, that's the same reason she always feels the need to, like, change up her appearance. She dyes her hair. She gets a haircut. She's wearing all these different outfits. it's like she can't. I don't know. She's completely in her own world. Oh, the Negascott thing. You got to be careful around that word. The Negascott. The Negascott. Completely different in the comic. I was very surprised. In the movie, it's almost like a one-off thing, like a little bit joke, where Negascott is like ironically like a cool dude, and they just kind of talk things out in private. And it's just sort of a joke that they gloss over. In the comic, it's like a key turning point in the story, and Negascott represents all of essentially Scott's baggage that he has to not fight but embrace. Oh my god, it's Bleach. Wait a second. Wait. Hang on. Wait. Wait. Isn't the power of understanding just Zangetsu? I'm pretty sure it's just Zangetsu. From Bleach. It's like the giant, like, meat cleaver sword that Ichigo has with, like, the bandage-wrapped hilt, the handle, and no, like, handguard. It's basically just Zangetsu. Wait. When? Is that like legitimately a Bleach? That's like a thing that fucking has to happen in Bleach. When Ichigo has to, No, wait, am I confusing that with something? Maybe I'm totally misremembering this. No, the fucking inner hollow. Hang on, I'm totally confusing this. In Bleach, Ichigo's inner hollow is like a thing that's actively trying to kill him. He doesn't have to embrace it. He has to fucking kill it. Well, eventually, I don't know. No, he doesn't kill it. Eventually, he like just kind of lets it chill out. It's like part of his character development. So those are kind of what happens in Scott Pilgrim, although that was written way before that happened in Bleach. So I'm actually just completely making shit up right now. Anyway, it represents all of Scott's baggage and all this stuff that he had to. He's basically tucked away and forgotten about safely in his safe little world, right? In his precious little life. And then he has to, like, accept that. He has to accept his shadow, his literal shadow. I thought that was, and that gives him, like, the result, and, like, a new outlook to go and fight Gideon. I like that a lot. Scott and Ramona ending up together in the... Okay, so his arc in the comic is that he's complete. Like I said, he's in his own head. He's totally self-centered and greedy and cowardly, and he's just completely spineless and toothless. How many synonyms can I come up with? And then he learns, when he gets the power of understanding, it's not self-respect. And it's not self-understanding in the comic. It's just understanding. It's that for the one time, he truly, truly breaks out of his own head, and he actually understands... Gideon's the guy he hates, like, the most in the entire world. He hates this guy to the most ever. But he understands him, and he's actually able to kind of empathize with him in a way. Not to the point where he thinks he's correct at all, because Gideon is obviously wrong. He's a total piece of shit. But he's able to empathize with him, and that is like a power. Oh, shit. I'm going to take all the stuff, now that I've accepted all of the things and negative stuff in my life that I've done or that's happened to me, I can use all of that information and look at this guy and see how there's like a common thread to all of this stuff, and actually recognize the error of my own ways. And I can improve as a person. And that's like his final character development. And I think it makes I was always a little iffy on them ending up together in the movie. I feel like the moral with the movie, it almost would have been driven home a lot better if Scott decided that he wanted to just be on his own, which is basically what Knives does in the comic. If he just wanted to be on his own and just like, you know what? This made me a better person. I think I can be single. But, you know, they gotta end up together, whatever. I think it would have been more of a mature take on it to not have them end up together, but whatever, fucking whatever. Them in the comic makes a lot more sense. Number one, you spent a lot of time seeing kind of what they like about each other. And then once they both have this final bit of development, Ramona, I almost said Romola. Romola flowers. Oh no. No. Cow Lady Gaming. Fuck. When Ramona gains the power of love, it's like, okay, they've both learned to get outside of themselves and stop being so self-centered. Well, with Ramona, it was a little more like not entirely her choice, but it was like, okay, this is like a problem she's had and she's overcome it, and now she can actually kind of extend out to other people. She can actually love Scott, like, truly, and like actually give herself to him in a way that she wasn't able to before. And now Scott can get out of his own head and understand the people around him. And you're like, okay, now I feel like the relationship can work out. It like, when I say that the fights are very almost secondary, it's like you're watching the evolution of, really, it's like a romance. It really is a love story. It's kind of corny, I feel like, to say, I thought it was this thing, but really, it was a love story. But really, this is. I think that really applies here. When I think about it, the story that's happening is you're watching a relationship from roughly the beginning to not the end, but oh my god, it's like before. You're watching it develop and hit a bunch of bumps, and the fights are just kind of like a thing that's happening on the side to explore, because Ramona is never going to open up about herself of her own accord. So how do you do that? You have these other characters who know her intimately on some level and fill in her backstory. Ramona never gets to tell her own story because she feels like she can't, and she's almost scared to tell her own story. So other people have to tell it for her. And by the end of the story, this relationship you've been watching has almost like they figured it out. They went through this rocky period, and then by overcoming these similar obstacles and having these, you know, a lot of trials and tribulations, I really liked. So they have this fight where, what is it? It's Ramona. It's like around the midway going into like it kind of is the transition into the third real act of this plot, where I think it's Ramona's mad at Scott because he was two-timing her with knives, and he wasn't a fucking man enough to break up with his fake high school girlfriend. And so she like kicks him out, and he's feeling, doesn't have anywhere to go because he was living with her, because I think it's like him and Wallace, they didn't sign a new lease, and he moved in with Ramona, and Wallace moved in with this random like French guy he met. And Wallace is just always fucking different guys. You know what I love? I love how Wallace never calls himself gay. It's only the other characters who call him gay. I mean, he is gay, obviously, but it's the other characters who announce that he's gay, and they're the ones who insist upon it. I think that's really funny. Wallace himself never really brings up, like, he doesn't be like, yeah, I'm so gay, I'm super gay. Obviously, he's doing extremely gay things, but everyone else is like, yeah, this is Wallace, he's like mondo gay. I think that's really funny. What was I talking about? Yeah, and then Scott goes over because Lisa's back in town. And he goes over, and there's like this weird emotional moment where they're talking, and they're talking about how I always kind of had feelings for you. Dude, I fucking really love the moment where things are getting kind of nutty, right? When they're having this conversation, and she asks him, like, do you think that, like, he's like, yeah, no, but, like, we never did anything. Like, we were never actually dating or going out or, you know, it wasn't, like, a full relationship. And she's asked him, like, well, do you think we should have? And there's, like, a moment of silence. And I was like, oh. And then the next thing, it's this fucking, like, the entire page is just her sitting there. And she's staring at him. And she says, do you think we should? And I was like, you can't see me right now. I'm leaning forward and my eyes are huge. I was like, oh my God. This is like that moment in Before Midnight. That's a good romance, you know? I feel like that's a good romance. Where there's a point where I legitimately, like, someone says something and I go, no, come, don't do this. No. And then I really liked how it ended up with Scott, waking up the next morning and you're like, oh God, oh no. And then she tells him, yeah, no, we didn't do anything. You don't remember this? And he's like, no. I think it's so funny that, like, he doesn't drink. He just completely forgot. He just blacked out. That he completely rejected her advance. And she was like, okay, whatever. And then they just, like, got food. And I was like, that's a nice moment for Scott as a character, like a test of his character. I like that. That I felt like was a really nice turning point where he's put in this kind of ultimatum situation. Like, he really has nowhere to go. He can't run anywhere else unless he just wants to walk the streets all night. Like a whore. So he's kind of just stuck here and he has to give a yes or no. And ultimately, like, he's finally forced into a situation where he has to be an adult and he has to make a decision. And he actually makes the mature decision. And you're like, oh shit. He's, like, kind of changing for the better. I appreciate that a lot. All the comparisons to fucking Scott. Kat always makes these comparisons to, like, oh my God. Especially when we were first going out. And she was learning all this stuff was new to her about me. Like, I was reading along and I'm like, oh my God, this sounds like something she says about me. Like, Ramona will describe Scott in a way, I'm like, that's how fucking Kat talks about me. And then I find it's like, there's a moment where, like, it's the first time Scott says that, like, he doesn't drink. And I was like, God fucking damn it. And I sent that to her and I'm like, when you found out I don't drink, were you, like, secretly super hyped because it made me more like Scott Pilgrim? What did she say? I gotta look at what this piece of shit said. I can go. I'm literally gonna look up what she said. She said, yeah, I creamed and said, oh, he's just like the Cellar plus R for real. This is how we talk to each other all the time. It's awful. There's this fucking panel. Oh my God. There's this panel, I want to say in volume 4 at the beginning, when they're having, like, a nice moment. They're, like, at someone's birthday party or something. And it's this cute moment, and they're eating together on a bench by themselves, and Ramona says, you know, Scott, I think you're the nicest guy I've ever dated. And he says, that's kind of sad. Because he really is. Especially at that point in the story. And fucking Kat sent me that panel before. Like, she sent me that page before. That series of panels. And then you fucking know what? I know you're listening to this, Lozy. Lozy fucking took that page and edited it so she's saying Taigen instead of Scott, and he added the both of us. And I was like, oh my fucking god. And she was so excited. She was, oh my god! Oh my god! Babe! She was so fucking excited when she saw that. And I got to the page and I was like, oh my god, it's the page. It's that page. I think she said that same line to me before, and I said something very similar. No, I probably said something really arrogant. I was like, yeah, because I'm fucking awesome. Because I'm not a bitch like Scott Pilgrim. Other stuff I liked about it. I don't know. I love the pacing. I love the way, I love how much time you just get with the characters to chill out. And just, it's all so interesting. I mentioned it before, but it's really cool. It was really cool to read this story where it feels like, because you're usually just with Scott, and you're usually only seeing, you know, what's happening to him. You get some cutaways to other characters, but for the most part, you're just getting him. And it's like it's neat to be reading the story, and then like you pop in somewhere, you see someone, and something's happened, you know, there's been some development on the site. It feels like a very lively, very active world. You know, you think about, you know, these stories like The Lord of the Rings, where there's so much time and effort put into building up a real history and a mythos and tons of different characters and regions and areas and locations, and those are all synonyms and characters and things and people and concepts that are important. And it really comes across like Middle Earth could be a real place. And I'm reading this and I'm like, this really feels like Toronto could be a real place. And thank God it's not. Thank God it's not real. But what if it was, you know? It's really selling me that this is an actual location that exists. Yeah, I don't know. I enjoyed this a lot. I'm actually very curious, and actually I'm excited. I would go so far as to say I'm excited to watch the actual animated series, because I want to see how it's adapted. I'm curious how the absurdism is presented in animation as opposed to live action or in the comic book. I'm curious. It's funny because I was rewatching some scenes from the movie and I was like, man, a lot of this is different. A lot of the scenes are switched around, but there's so many jokes in the movie that are fucking great. Excuse me. There's a lot of that's just a funny movie. Like, it's a really, really funny movie. It's an Edgar Wright film, you know, so it's to be expected. Man, that is like, it's such a perfect fit for his style, because he really gets to go all out with like the other, like all of his other movies. I've seen like a couple of his other films, and for the most part, he has a very, very recognizable style, but this is such a perfect fit for it, because usually it comes out in like the editing and the dialogue and stuff like that, and maybe sometimes the script, but this is like the whole thing. Like the dialogue and the editing are extremely unique, and just the presentation with all of the little gags, the visual stuff happening, the effects, which I think have actually aged pretty well because they're intentionally very stylized. So I think it works. Yeah, I think it works pretty well. Even though it's from 2010, I think the effects in the movie hold up. Such a perfect fit, and all these new jokes he's written in, man, that is a very enjoyable movie. But I would say that I kind of like the fact that they're different experiences. Because you were never going to fit, having read the comic, you were never going to fit all of that into a movie. You did, maybe like 2 movies, 3 movies, maybe. A full like series makes way more sense. You hear like, oh, they're doing an anime. Oh, yeah, that's like a no-brainer, dude. How has this not happened before? But for what it's doing, it's good, and in the things that it has to cut, it provides a different kind of story. And I think I like that. I like that they're different experiences, because I was able to go to because they have a lot of the same stuff. They have a similar vibe, and I think the tone is very much preserved in what they can do. You lose a lot of the slice of life elements, but they preserve a lot of the wackiness and the sense of humor and the basic character arcs, right? You're gonna get all of that out of the movie. But it's kind of cool to be able to go to the source material, and it feels like it's worth reading on its own, you know? I don't know if I really like the idea, or I don't know if I agree with the idea that an adaptation... I feel like in many cases, it's almost like an adaptation renders the original work, especially when you go from like comic to screen, you know, kind of like renders it obsolete. Like you get that, I feel like with a lot of anime, like, is there really is there really a point to reading the manga? Unless the manga literally stops unless the anime literally stops before the manga finishes. I like the adaptation, the idea of an adaptation which is preserving most of the original, but providing a different kind of experience. And I'm trying to think of similar instances where that happened. I remember like part 5 of JoJo's, there's like some new content, like there's new scenes and stuff. And the new scenes that they added are like great. Like they feel like they were, if I hadn't already read the manga, I wouldn't have even known. It doesn't feel like filler. It feels completely natural. Like something that would have been in the original. And that stuff's great. Leave a comment down below if you have an instance of like an adaptation that really feels like a different, like good, but is a different experience. I think that would be an interesting topic. I really enjoyed the comic. I see why this is one of my beloved's favorite things. I get it now. I think it's really funny that there's this like Manic Pixie Dream Girl thing, and Ramona Flowers is kind of like the poster Manic Pixie Dream Girl for that, because like honestly, like reading the story, she doesn't really fit. She fits the stereotype until you realize that it's like a character flaw. Like the point of the story is that it's kind of not a good or healthy thing for her. It's actually kind of destructive, and it creates a ton of problems in her life. And for Scott, the idea that some girl is going to fall out of the sky and change your entire world and make you a better person is also a misconception. In some way, like, yeah, his involvement with her does make him a better person, but really, he has to figure all that shit out on his own. Like, his real character development, like the big character development stuff, most of that happens when he's alone, when he's by himself, or that whole segment when after Kim moves away and he goes to visit her in Montreal, I think. All that stuff was great, and when that's where the Negascott thing happens, and all that is like, this is a dumb worldview. You do not want to be like the stereotypes that people have of these characters. Yeah.